Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor, the violet-eyed icon of Hollywood, was as enigmatic in death as she was in life. Known for her opulent lifestyle and a career that spanned decades, Elizabeth left behind a final request that stunned even those closest to her. She demanded to arrive at her own funeral fashionably late, not metaphorically, literally. Her instructions were clear. The service was to begin, and only then would her casket arrive 15 minutes later. This wasn't a whimsical joke. It was a calculated move to cement her legacy as a woman who defied convention at every turn. But there's more. Elizabeth, who had been married 8 times, also requested to be buried with a pair of her favorite earrings, diamond studs that were rumored to be worth more than most people's homes. Her burial site, located at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, is unmarked, a stark contrast to her larger-than-life persona. Why? Some speculate it was to avoid becoming a tourist attraction, while others believe it was her final act of privacy in a life lived under relentless public scrutiny. Even in death, Elizabeth Taylor orchestrated a performance, leaving behind a legacy as dazzling and mysterious as the jewels she adored. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford, the queen of melodrama and one of the most polarizing figures in Hollywood, left behind a burial request that was as chilling as her on-screen performances. Despite her glamorous image, Joan's final wishes revealed a fractured personal life. She requested to be cremated and buried in a modest crypt at Ferncliff Cemetery in New York, far from the glitz of Hollywood. But the real shock lies in what she didn't want. Joan explicitly excluded her 2 eldest children, Christina and Christopher, from her will, leaving them with nothing but a single cutting line, for reasons which are well known to them. This decision came after years of public speculation about her strained relationship with her children, fueled by Christina's later memoir that painted Joan as a tyrannical figure behind closed doors. Adding to the intrigue, Joan's ashes were placed in a crypt alongside her final husband, Alfred Steele, but her burial site remains understated, almost anonymous. For a woman who spent her life commanding attention, her final resting place is eerily quiet, leaving behind more questions than answers about the true nature of her life and relationships. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi, the man who immortalized Count Dracula on screen, made a burial request that blurred the line between his life and his most famous role. When he passed away in the mid-20th century, Bela's family honored his wish to be buried in his full Dracula costume, complete with the iconic black cape. This wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a deeply personal decision. Bela had struggled to separate himself from the character that made him a star, and in the end, he chose to embrace it fully. But here's where it gets even stranger. Despite his fame, Bela died nearly penniless, his career having been overshadowed by typecasting and personal struggles. His funeral was a modest affair, attended by only a handful of close friends and family. Yet his burial in the Dracula costume turned his grave into a macabre pilgrimage site for fans of the horror genre. Bela Lugosi's final wish wasn't just a nod to his most famous role. It was a haunting reminder of how the character consumed his life, even in death. His grave, located at Holy Cross Cemetery in California, remains a testament to the man who became inseparable from the monster he portrayed. Wallace Reid. Wallace Reid was the golden boy of silent cinema, a matinee idol whose face graced countless screens during the early 20th century. But behind the polished image was a man whose life unraveled in ways few could have imagined. His death in the early 1920s shocked Hollywood, but it was his burial request that left many speechless. Reid, who had been a symbol of vitality and charm, asked to be buried with a small, unassuming item, a silver locket containing a photograph of his wife, Dorothy Davenport. This wasn't just a sentimental gesture. It was a haunting reminder of the guilt he carried. Reid's struggles with substance dependency, which began after a studio-prescribed treatment for an injury, had devastated his family. Dorothy, who had stood by him through his decline, became the keeper of his legacy after his death. What makes this request even more poignant is the fact that Reid's burial site was chosen to be as modest as possible. despite his fame. He wanted no grand mausoleum, no towering monument. Instead, he was interred in a simple grave, as if to erase the larger-than-life persona that had consumed him. The locket, hidden from public view, became a symbol of the man behind the myth, a man who, in his final moments, sought solace in the love he had nearly destroyed. Pola Negri. Pola Negri, the enigmatic star of the silent film era, was known for her dramatic flair both on and off the screen. Her life was a whirlwind of romance, scandal, and reinvention, but it was her final burial wish that cemented her reputation as one of Hollywood's most eccentric figures. Negri, who had been romantically linked to Rudolph Valentino, made a request that stunned even her closest confidants. She asked to be buried with a vial of Valentino's ashes, a claim that sparked controversy and disbelief. The truth behind this request is murky. Valentino, who had died decades earlier, was never officially cremated, and no record of his ashes being distributed exists. Yet Negri insisted she possessed a small portion of them, a keepsake from their passionate, albeit short-lived, relationship. Whether this was a fabrication or a genuine relic, it became part of her mystique. Adding to the intrigue, Negri's burial site in California was designed to reflect her European roots, complete with ornate carvings and a touch of old-world glamour. Her grave became a shrine to her theatrical life, but the mystery of the alleged ashes remains unsolved. Was it a final act of devotion, or one last performance from a woman who lived for the spotlight? Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead, the magnetic actress known for her husky voice and rebellious spirit, left behind a burial request that was as unconventional as her life. Tallulah, who was as famous for her off-screen antics as her on-screen performances, had a peculiar wish. She wanted to be buried with a bottle of bourbon, a pack of cigarettes, and a copy of her favorite book, the Bible. This combination of items perfectly encapsulated the contradictions of her personality, a woman who lived life on her own terms, but still held on to a sense of spirituality. Her funeral, held in the early 1960s, was a somber affair, but her burial instructions added a touch of her signature irreverence. There's another layer to her story that few know. Tallulah's final resting place is in St. Paul's Churchyard in Maryland, far from the glitz of Hollywood. She chose this location because it was close to her family's roots, a surprising decision for someone who spent much of her life defying tradition. Even in death, Tallulah Bankhead managed to blend humor, defiance, and a touch of sentimentality, leaving behind a legacy as unforgettable as the woman herself. Clark Gable. Clark Gable, the king of Hollywood and star of Gone with the Wind, had a burial request that revealed a deeply personal side to the man behind the legend. Gable, who passed away in the early 60s, was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, but it's the location of his grave that holds the real story. He chose to be interred next to his third wife, Carole Lombard, the great love of his life. Lombard passed away in the early 1940s, and Gable carried the weight of her loss for the rest of his life. Despite remarrying twice after her death, he made it clear that he wanted to spend eternity by her side. What's even more poignant is that Gable's grave is marked with a simple plaque, reflecting his desire for a modest and private resting place far removed from the grandeur of his Hollywood persona. His burial wish wasn't just about love, it was a testament to the enduring grief and devotion he carried with him for decades. For a man who was larger than life on screen, his final resting place tells a story of quiet vulnerability and a love that transcended time. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling star of The Adventures of Robin Hood, had a burial request that was as flamboyant as the roles he played. Flynn, who passed away in the late 50s, was buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, but his final wish was to take one of his most prized possessions with him, a 6-foot-long statue of a woman. The statue, which had been a centerpiece in his home, was said to symbolize his hedonistic lifestyle and love of beauty. However, the statue was ultimately not included in his burial, as it was deemed too impractical. Instead, Flynn was laid to rest with a simple marker, a stark contrast to the extravagance he was known for in life. There's another detail that adds to the intrigue. Flynn's funeral was attended by only a small group of close friends and family, a quiet farewell for a man whose life had been anything but. His burial wish, though partially unfulfilled, remains a fascinating glimpse into the personality of a man who lived unapologetically and left behind a legacy as one of Hollywood's most charismatic and controversial figures. Jean Harlow. Jean Harlow, the original blonde bombshell of Hollywood, left behind a legacy of glamour, tragedy, and a burial story that continues to fascinate. Harlow passed away in the late 1930s at just 26 years old, leaving the world stunned by the loss of one of its brightest stars. Her burial wish was simple, yet deeply symbolic. She wanted to be laid to rest in a white gown surrounded by white flowers in a white marble crypt. This wasn't just a nod to her iconic platinum blonde image, it was a reflection of her desire to be remembered as pure and untarnished, despite the scandals and heartbreaks that had plagued her short life. Harlow's final resting place is in the Great Mausoleum at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, a site often referred to as the Taj Mahal of the West. What many don't know is that her crypt was paid for by her lover, William Powell, who was so devastated by her death that he ensured she would have a burial fit for a queen. Even in death, Jean Harlow's life was shrouded in both beauty and mystery, a fitting end for a woman who defined an era of Hollywood glamour. Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford, known as America's sweetheart and one of the most powerful women in early Hollywood, had a burial request that reflected her deep connection to her family and her legacy. Mary, who passed away in the late 1970s, was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, but her final resting place was far from ordinary. She chose to be interred in the Garden of Memory, a serene and secluded area of the cemetery, alongside her mother and siblings. This decision was a poignant reminder of the importance of family in her life, despite the immense fame and fortune she had achieved. What's even more intriguing is that Pickford's crypt is inscribed with the words, "America's Sweetheart," a title she had both embraced and resented during her lifetime. Her burial site is a quiet, understated tribute to a woman who helped shape the film industry, but often struggled with the pressures of her public image. Mary Pickford's final wish wasn't about grandeur or spectacle. It was about finding peace in the company of those she loved most, a stark contrast to the larger-than-life persona she portrayed on screen. Rudolph Valentino. Rudolph Valentino, the Latin lover and one of the first true sex symbols of Hollywood, left behind a burial story that is as dramatic as the films he starred in. Valentino passed away suddenly in the mid-20s at just 31 years old, leaving the entertainment world in mourning. His burial wish was never formally documented, but his close friends and family ensured that his grave reflected his iconic status. Valentino was interred in a borrowed crypt at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, a temporary arrangement that has now lasted for nearly a century. The crypt, owned by a friend, became a shrine for his adoring fans, many of whom still visit to this day. One of the most fascinating aspects of Valentino's burial is the legend of the Lady in Black, a mysterious woman who began visiting his grave every year on the anniversary of his death, leaving a single red rose. This tradition has been carried on by others, turning his grave into a site of enduring devotion and intrigue. Rudolph Valentino's burial wasn't just the end of his life, it was the beginning of a myth that continues to captivate the world. Greta Garbo. Greta Garbo, the enigmatic star who famously declared she wanted to be alone, carried her desire for privacy into death. Garbo, who passed away in the early 1990s, had a burial request that reflected her lifelong aversion to the spotlight. She chose to be cremated and buried in her native Sweden, far from the Hollywood glamour that had defined her career. Her ashes were interred in a modest grave at Skogskista Garden Cemetery in Stockholm, a UNESCO World Heritage Site known for its serene beauty. What's particularly striking is that Garbo had purchased the burial plot decades earlier, in the 50s, long before her death. This decision wasn't just practical, it was deeply symbolic, a way of reconnecting with her roots after years of self-imposed exile in New York City. Even in death, Garbo's life remained shrouded in mystery. Her grave is marked with a simple headstone bearing only her name, a stark contrast to the larger-than-life persona she portrayed on screen. For a woman who spent her life avoiding public scrutiny, her final resting place is a quiet, understated tribute to her enduring legacy as one of Hollywood's most elusive and fascinating stars. Mae West. Mae West, the queen of double entendres and unapologetic confidence, had a burial request that reflected her larger-than-life persona. West, who passed away in the late 1980s, was buried in Cypress Hills Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, the city where she was born. Her final resting place is in the family mausoleum, a decision that speaks to her deep connection to her roots, despite her decades of Hollywood stardom. What makes her burial particularly fascinating is the inscription on her crypt. It reads, "Mae West, I'm no angel," a nod to one of her most famous films and a fitting epitaph for a woman who defied societal norms at every turn. There's another detail that adds to the intrigue. West was buried in a gown she had personally selected years before her death, a glamorous outfit that reflected her belief in always being ready for the spotlight, even in the afterlife. Mae West's burial wasn't just a farewell, it was a final performance, a testament to her enduring wit, charm, and refusal to conform. For a woman who once said, "You only live once, but if you do it right, once is enough." Her final resting place is a perfect reflection of a life lived on her own terms. W.C. Fields. W.C. Fields, the legendary comedian known for his sharp wit and disdain for conventional norms, left behind a burial request that was as eccentric as the man himself. Fields, who passed away in the late 40s, had a lifelong aversion to California, despite spending much of his career in Hollywood. He famously joked that he wanted his epitaph to read, "On the whole, I'd rather be in Philadelphia," a nod to his hometown and his dry sense of humor. True to his wishes, Fields was interred in Forest Lawn Memorial Park in California, but his grave marker does not bear the epitaph he had so often quipped about. Instead, his resting place is marked with a simple plaque, a surprisingly understated tribute for a man who lived life so boldly. What's even more fascinating is that Fields had originally planned to be buried in Philadelphia, but his family ultimately decided against it, citing logistical challenges. This decision has fueled speculation over the years, with some suggesting that Fields' burial in California was a final irony for a man who had spent much of his life mocking the state. Even in death, Fields managed to leave behind a legacy of humor, contradiction, and a touch of mystery, ensuring that his name would remain as unforgettable as his one-liners. Theda Bara. Theda Bara, one of the silent film era's most enigmatic stars, was as mysterious in death as she was in life. Known as the original vamp of Hollywood, she captivated audiences with her dark, seductive roles and an aura of mystique carefully crafted by the studios. However, her final burial wishes revealed a surprising departure from the dramatic persona she portrayed on screen. Bara, who passed away in the mid-1950s, requested to be cremated and for her ashes to be scattered in the Pacific Ocean. This choice was unusual for the time, as cremation was not a common practice in mid-20th century America, especially for someone of her fame. What makes her burial even more intriguing is the fact that her ashes were not scattered immediately. For years, her remains were kept in an urn by her family, who struggled to fulfill her wishes due to logistical and emotional challenges. It wasn't until decades later that her ashes were finally released into the ocean, honoring her original request. Adding to the mystery, much of Bara's legacy has been lost to time, as most of her films were lost due to a fire at Fox Studios in the 1930s. This tragic loss of her work has only deepened the fascination surrounding her life and death. Even in her final moments, Theda Bara remained a figure of intrigue, her burial wishes reflecting a desire to return to the elements, far removed from the artificial glamour of Hollywood. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.